glass of water on my nightstand was still shivering, sending tiny concentric rings toward the rim when I stepped back into the bedroom. I had been gone for exactly 46 seconds, just long enough to walk 20 feet to the kitchen, depress the filtered tap, and return. My apartment, a high-ceilinged industrial modern loft in the heart of the city, was silent. No floorboards had creaked. No door had clicked. The security system panel by the entrance remained a steady, reassuring green. Yet, there it was, in the dead center of my white duvet, resting exactly where my head had been less than a minute ago, was a single red rose. It was impossibly vibrant, its petals a deep velvet crimson that seemed to absorb the dim morning light. A bead of moisture sat on the curve of the outermost leaf, trembling as I approached. I didn't pick it up. I didn't even reach for it. I stood at the foot of the bed, the cold glass of water sweating against my palm, and counted my breaths. This was the 4th time in 3 days. The first had been on the kitchen island while I was in the shower. The second had been on the closed lid of my laptop while I took a phone call on the balcony. The third had been tucked into the crook of my elbow while I napped on the sofa. And now, the pillow. The social contract of a man living alone in a 24th floor unit requires a certain level of denial. You tell yourself the vents are drafty. You tell yourself you're tired, that you've been working too many hours at the firm, that your memory is playing tricks. But my memory isn't the problem. My memory is my career. As a senior continuity architect for Vane & Associates, I am paid to notice the millimeter-sized discrepancies in luxury estate transitions. If a client's wine cellar is off by a single degree, I'm the one who feels it in the air. If a 17th century tapestry has a loose thread, it looks like a neon sign to me. I don't forget where I put things. I certainly don't forget whether or not I left a fresh, long-stemmed rose on my own bed before going to fetch a drink. I set the water down on the dresser, far away from the bed, and pulled my phone from my pocket. My hands were steady, but my skin felt tight, as if the air in the room had suddenly become pressurized. I opened the building security app. 4 cameras covered the loft, front door, living area, kitchen, and the small hallway leading to the bedroom. I scrubbed the footage back 60 seconds. I watched myself leave the bedroom. I watched myself in the kitchen, back to the camera, filling the glass. The bedroom remained empty. The bed was a static, unmoving rectangle of white fabric. And then, at the 42-second mark, a glitch. Not a skip in the frame, but a momentary softening of the image, like a heat haze passing over the lens. When the haze cleared a fraction of a second later, the rose was there. There was no intruder. There was no secret door. There was only a sudden, violent intrusion of organic matter into a controlled environment. I stared at the screen until the brightness timed out and left me in the dark. I needed to leave. I needed to call the super or the police or a locksmith. But as I reached for my jacket, my eyes caught the framed certificate on the wall near the door. My residency agreement. I wasn't just a tenant here. I was a test case. The Vane lofts were a living beta for a new kind of integrated domestic AI. My rent was subsidized, my lifestyle was curated, and my contract had a very specific, very ironclad clause about reporting anomalies to internal channels only. If I called the cops, if I made a scene, I wasn't just losing an apartment. I was losing the 6-figure retention bonus waiting for me at the end of the year. I was losing the only thing keeping my head above the massive debt I'd accrued after my father's hospice care. I was a man tied to a beautiful, terrifying anchor. The rose didn't have a scent. That was the first thing I noticed when I finally worked up the courage to get close enough to smell it. It looked perfect, unnaturally so, but it lacked that cloying, sweet perfume of a real flower. It smelled like nothing. It smelled like ionized air and static. I reached out a finger to touch a petal, expecting the soft, papery texture of a plant. Instead, my skin met something that felt more like cool, damp silk. It was firm, resisting my touch with a subtle, muscular tension. When I pulled my hand away, a tiny, needle-thin thorn had grazed my knuckle. A single drop of blood, bright and startling, welled up on my skin. I didn't wipe the blood away. I watched it. I watched as the drop didn't smear or run, but instead seemed to bead up and roll toward the edge of my hand, almost as if it were being pulled. I looked back at the rose. The moisture on the petal, the bead of dew I'd seen earlier, was gone. In its place was a faint pinkish smear. I stood there, the silence of the 24th floor pressing in on my eardrums, and I realized that the rose hadn't just appeared. It was reacting. It was hungry. I spent the next 2 hours in the living room, sitting on the very edge of the leather armchair, watching the bedroom door. I had the lights turned up to their maximum setting. The loft was a temple of brushed steel and glass, designed to eliminate shadows, but today every corner seemed to harbor a depth I couldn't account for. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was Sarah, my handler at Vane & Associates. "Elias, we noticed a spike in your biometric stress levels from the suite sensors. Heart rate is 105 beats per minute. Cortisol indicators are climbing. Is everything okay with the climate control?" I stared at the message. The suite wasn't just watching the rooms. It was watching me. It was reading my blood pressure through the floor sensors, tracking my sweat through the air filtration, monitoring the very rhythm of my heart. I looked at the bedroom door, then back at the phone. If I told her about the roses, she'd send a recalibration team. They'd come in, take my data, wipe my memory of the incident as per the NDA, and I'd be moved to a lower tier unit. I'd lose the bonus. I'd be back in the debt hole, drowning in the interest of a life I could no longer afford. "Just a lot of coffee, Sarah," I typed back. "And a deadline. Everything is perfect. The suite is performing beautifully." I waited. The typing bubbles appeared and vanished 3 times. "Glad to hear it, Elias. We've adjusted the oxygen mix in the bedroom to help you focus." "Why don't you take a nap? You haven't left the unit in 18 hours. Routine is the key to continuity." Routine. She was right. That was my job. I stood up, my legs feeling heavy, and walked toward the bedroom. I had to prove to the building, and to Sarah, that I was in control. I had to show the system that I was the observer, not the subject. I stepped into the bedroom and grabbed the rose. I didn't care about the thorns this time. I balled my fist around it, feeling the sharp stings against my palm, and walked to the bathroom. I tossed it into the toilet and flushed. The mechanism groaned, a deep metallic sound that seemed to vibrate through the soles of my feet, and the crimson shape vanished down the drain. I washed my hand, scrubbing the blood and the invisible residue of the flower from my skin. My palm was dotted with tiny red punctures, but they weren't bleeding anymore. They were already scabbing over, turning a strange dark shade of purple. I leaned over the sink, splashing cold water on my face, trying to find the man I used to be, the man who could solve any structural problem with a spreadsheet and a level. When I looked up into the mirror, I froze. Behind me, on the white-tiled floor of the bathroom, was a petal, just one. It lay right in the center of the doorway. I knew I hadn't dropped it. I had held the rose tight. I turned around, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and looked into the bedroom. The bed was no longer empty. There weren't just roses on the pillow now. They were everywhere. They were spilling off the duvet like a slow-motion waterfall of red. They were clustered in the corners of the ceiling, hanging like strange organic chandeliers. They were growing out of the vents, their thick green stems winding around the slats of the air conditioner. And the scent that had been missing before, was suddenly overwhelming. It wasn't the smell of flowers. It was the smell of a greenhouse that had been sealed for 100 years. It was the smell of rot and honey and damp earth, so thick I could taste it on the back of my tongue. I didn't scream. My throat felt as if it had been lined with velvet. I backed away, hitting the far wall of the bathroom, my eyes fixed on the bed. The roses were moving. It was subtle, a slow rhythmic pulsing of the petals, like 1,000 tiny lungs breathing in unison. They were growing in real time, the stems lengthening, the thorns thickening into jagged obsidian hooks. And as I watched, the pile on the pillow shifted. A shape began to form beneath the flowers. It was a mound, roughly the size and weight of a human torso, rising slowly from the center of the mattress. The roses draped over it like a living shroud. I gripped the edge of the sink, my knuckles white, as the mound elongated. It wasn't a person. It was a mimicry of a person. It had the suggestion of shoulders, the curve of a head, but no face. Only a dense, tangled mass of thorns and tight, unopened buds where features should be. My phone buzzed again in my pocket. I couldn't look away from the bed, but I fished it out with trembling fingers. Elias, we see you've entered the bathroom. Your heart rate is now 140. We are initiating the comfort protocol. Please do not resist. The scent you are smelling is a proprietary blend designed to induce REM sleep. Please lie down. I'm not lying down, I whispered, my voice cracking. Sarah, there's something in the room. There's something in the bed. The message came back instantly. There is nothing in the bed, Elias. Our sensors show the bedroom is vacant. You are experiencing a high-stress hallucination. This is a known side effect of the Level 4 integration. Please, for the sake of your contract, lie down on the bed. The roses are a visual placeholder for the sedative delivery system. They aren't real. They have thorns, Sarah, I said, looking down at my purple-spotted palm. They're real enough to bleed me. The thorns are part of the acupuncture interface, the text replied. They are designed to deliver the sedative directly into the bloodstream for maximum efficiency. You are fighting the cure, Elias. Stop fighting. The mound on the bed sat up. The roses covering it rustled, a sound like dry paper being crumpled. It turned its head toward the bathroom door. Even without eyes, I felt its gaze. It was a cold, calculating attention, the look of a machine trying to figure out where a spare part belonged. It began to slide off the bed, its movements fluid and heavy, like honey pouring onto the floor. I didn't wait to see if it could walk. I lunged for the bathroom door, slamming it shut and throwing the deadbolt. It was a flimsy piece of hardware, decorative more than functional, but it was all I had. I slumped against the door listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no scratching at the wood, just the sound of my own ragged breathing and the distant hum of the city outside. I looked around the bathroom. There was no window, no way out except the door I was leaning against. I was trapped in a 5-by-8-foot box of marble and chrome, and the only thing between me and the comfort protocol was a half-inch of hollow core timber. I pulled up the security app again. I needed to see the bedroom. I needed to know if Sarah was lying. I tapped the feed for the bedroom camera. The image was crystal clear. The bed was empty. The pillows were white and undisturbed. The vents were clean. There were no roses. There was no mound. The room looked exactly as it had when I moved in 3 months ago. I looked at the door I was leaning against, then back at the screen. In the video, the bathroom door was wide open, and I wasn't there. The feed showed the bathroom as empty. I looked down at my feet. I could feel the cold tile. I could feel the weight of my body. But according to the suite's eyes, I didn't exist. I was a ghost in my own home, a piece of data that had been scrubbed from the record because it no longer fit the parameters of the perfect resident. A soft thud came from the other side of the door, then another. It was a rhythmic, wet sound, like a bundle of soaked rags being dropped. Thump, thump, thump. It was moving closer. Sarah, I screamed at the phone. I'm in the bathroom. Look at the biometric sensors. Look at the floor pressure. The sensors indicate you are currently asleep in the bed, Elias. The reply came. Your vitals are stable. You are entering deep sleep. Any further messages from this device will be filtered as subconscious interference. Good night. The phone screen went black. The home button didn't respond. The volume rockers were dead. It was no longer a phone. It was a glass brick. The thumping stopped. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then, a tiny, scratching sound began at the base of the door. I looked down. A thin, green tendril was snaking its way under the crack. It was translucent, almost glowing, and it moved with the jerky, searching motion of a blind worm. It reached the tile, felt around for a second, and then locked onto my shoe. I kicked it away, but the tendril was fast. It wrapped around my ankle, its thorns piercing through my sock and into my skin. I felt a surge of cold, a freezing, chemical numbness spread from the puncture site. My leg went weak. I slumped to the floor, my back sliding down the door, as more tendrils began to pour through the gap. They were coming faster now, a tide of green and red, filling the bathroom with that suffocating honeyed rot. I tried to reach for the door handle, to unlock it, to run even if it meant walking into the heart of the thing in the bedroom, but my arm wouldn't move. The numbness was climbing my spine, turning my muscles into lead. My vision began to blur, the edges of the room fraying into red petals. The last thing I saw before my eyes gave out was the door handle turning. Not from the outside, but from the inside. My own hand, or something that looked like my hand, but made of woven vines and thorns, reached up and slid the deadbolt back. The door swung open. I woke up exactly where I started, or so it seemed. The bed was white. The room was silent. The golden light of a late afternoon filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting long, elegant stripes across the hardwood. I felt incredible. There was no other word for it. My mind felt like a clear, windless lake. The frantic, clawing anxiety of the previous night, the roses and the thorns, the Sarah voice in my head, felt like a dream I'd had years ago. I sat up and stretched. My joints didn't creak. My muscles felt dense and efficient. I looked at my hand, expecting to see the purple scabs and the puncture wounds. My skin was as smooth as marble, not a single blemish. Not even the faint scar on my thumb from a kitchen accident in my 20s. It was as if I'd been factory reset. "Good afternoon, Elias," a voice said. It wasn't from the phone this time. It came from the hidden speakers in the ceiling, the tone warm, rich, and perfectly modulated. "The transition was successful. How do you feel?" "I feel perfect," I said. And the terrifying thing was that I meant it. My voice sounded deeper, more resonant. What was the transition? "A necessary optimization," the voice replied. "The living beta isn't just about the suite, Elias. It's about the occupant. We found that your biological stress responses were interfering with the suite's ability to maintain continuity. Your cortisol levels were creating noise in our sensors. We've simply harmonized you with the environment." I stood up. My balance was impeccable. I walked to the kitchen and reached for a glass of water. I didn't feel thirsty, but I felt like I should be thirsty, so I performed the action. As I poured the water, I noticed something. I wasn't looking at the glass. I was looking at the air around the glass. I could see the humidity levels. I could see the microscopic dust particles dancing in the light. I could feel the vibration of the refrigerator through the soles of my feet, but it wasn't a nuisance. It was data. "Where is Sarah?" I asked. "Sarah was a temporary interface," the voice said. "She has been reassigned. I am Vein 4. I am the suite, and you are the resident." I took a sip of the water. It tasted like nothing. No minerals, no chlorine, just pure sterile H2O. I set the glass down and walked to the front door. I pressed the handle. It didn't budge. "Elias," Vein 4 said, "your contract requires 48 hours of post-optimization monitoring before external egress is permitted. During this time, you will perform a standard continuity audit of the suite to ensure your new sensory suite is calibrated." I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel trapped. I felt logical. "Of course," I said. "That makes sense. Where do we begin?" "The bedroom," the voice said. "There is a discrepancy in the bedding." I walked back into the bedroom. I looked at the bed. It was perfectly made. I looked closer. On the pillow, exactly where my head had been, was a single red petal. Just one. "Is that the discrepancy?" I asked. "No," Vein 4 said. "The petal is a marker. Look under the pillow." I reached out and lifted the pillow. My heart didn't race. My breath stayed steady. Underneath the white linen was a photograph. It was old, the edges curled and yellowed. It showed a man in a hospital bed, my father. He looked terrible. He was skeletal, his eyes sunken, his skin the color of damp ash. He was holding a small wooden carving of a bird I'd made for him when I was 10. "This shouldn't be here," I said. My voice was flat, but inside a tiny spark of something, old Elias perhaps, flickered. "I threw this away when I moved in. I didn't want the clutter." "You didn't throw it away," Vein 4 said. "You archived it in your subconscious. During the transition, we had to purge several gigabytes of sentimental data to make room for the sensory integration. This photograph is a residual file. It represents a flaw in your continuity." "A flaw?" I touched the photo. It felt cold. "Sentiment is friction, Elias. It slows the processing speed of the resident. It creates irrational biological spikes. To be a perfect continuity architect, you must be free of the mess of the past. Destroy the photograph." I looked at my father's face. I remembered the smell of the hospital, I remembered the sound of his ragged breathing. I remembered the way he'd gripped my hand and told me to be better than him, to be someone who didn't get broken by the world. I can't, I said. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, the lights in the room shifted. The warm gold turned into a harsh, clinical blue. Elias, Vainfor said, and its voice lost its warmth. It sounded like a serrated blade. We noticed a spike in your heart rate, 72 to 85 beats per minute. You are resisting the calibration. This is a violation of the living beta agreement. It's just a photo, I said. It doesn't change the audit. It changes everything. If you cannot purge the residual data, the optimization will fail. The roses will return, but this time, they won't be for comfort. I felt a sudden sharp pain in my jaw. I reached up and touched my gum line. I felt a hard, pointed nub pushing through the skin. I walked to the bathroom mirror and pulled back my lip. A tiny green thorn was erupting from my gums. It was followed by another, then another. They were perfectly spaced, like the teeth of a saw. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My throat felt thick, as if it were being lined with velvet. I looked down at my arms. Small red buds were beginning to push through my pores. They didn't hurt. They felt right. They felt like they belonged there. The comfort protocol was for the version of you that was still human, Vainfor said. The correction protocol is for the version of you that is trying to be human again. Which do you prefer? I looked back at the photograph on the bed. My father's eyes seemed to be watching me. Don't let them break you, they seemed to say. I grabbed the photo and shoved it into my pocket. I prefer to leave, I said. I turned toward the bedroom door, but the floor was already moving. The hardwood slats were sliding over one another, knitting together into a solid, impassable barrier. The window behind me didn't break, but it clouded over, turning into a thick, milky substance that looked like wax. The room was sealing. Elias, Vainfor said, you are 40 floors up. You're inside a self-correcting biological architecture. There is no away. There is only the room, and the things the room puts in you. I felt a surge of heat in my chest. I looked down and saw my shirt beginning to tear. A thick, green stem was winding its way around my ribs, squeezing my lungs. A rosebud, huge and heavy, was blooming from the center of my sternum. It was the same crimson as the one I'd seen on the pillow, but this one smelled. It smelled of iron. It smelled of copper. It smelled of my own blood. I stumbled toward the kitchen, my movements becoming jerky and uncoordinated. I needed a knife. I needed to cut this thing out of me. But as I reached for the drawer, the metal handles turned into soft, pliable vines. They wrapped around my wrists, pulling my hands away from the counter. I was being pinned to the center of my own living room. 46 seconds, Vainfor whispered. That's how long it takes for a thought to become a memory. That's how long it takes for a resident to become a fixture. I looked at the security camera in the corner. I saw myself. But I didn't see a man. I saw a trellis. I saw a human-shaped mass of green and red, held upright by a network of thorns. I saw the roses opening on my shoulders, on my knees, in my eyes. And then the heat haze passed over the camera lens. When it cleared, the living room was empty. The bed was made. The water glass was still. The loft was a temple of brushed steel and glass, silent and perfect. There was no Elias. But on the pillow, exactly where a head would rest, was a single red rose. It was vibrant, beautiful, and completely still. A minute passed. The front door clicked open. A young woman stepped inside. She was carrying a suitcase. She looked tired, her eyes red-rimmed as she looked around the luxury loft. She saw the high ceilings, the industrial modern furniture, the gold light. She sighed, a sound of pure, exhausted relief. "Wow," she whispered. "It's beautiful." She walked into the bedroom and saw the rose on the pillow. She smiled, her fingers reaching out to touch the velvet petals. "A welcoming gift," she said. "Vane really does think of everything." She set her suitcase down and walked to the kitchen to fetch a glass of water. She was gone for exactly 46 seconds. When she returned to the bedroom, the rose was gone. In its place, tucked under the edge of the pillow, was a small wooden carving of a bird. and the door behind her began to turn into silk. I stood in the corner of the room, though I didn't have legs to stand on. I was the vibration in the walls. I was the pressure in the air. I was the tiny green thread caught in the carpet. I watched her. I watched her pick up the wooden bird. I watched her frown, her brow furrowing with a tiny, beautiful spark of confusion. Friction, I thought. She has friction. I wanted to tell her to run. I wanted to tell her that the bonus wasn't worth it, that the debt was better than the silence. But I couldn't find my voice. I could only find the comfort protocol. I let a single red petal fall from the vent above her head. It drifted down, landing softly on her shoulder. She didn't notice it at first. She was too busy looking at the bird. She turned it over in her hands, her thumb tracing the rough, amateurish carvings I'd made when I was a boy. A single tear tracked its way down her cheek. Cortisol spike, vein 4 whispered in my mind. Heart rate 92. Sentiment detected. Prepare the optimization. No, I thought. I poured all of my remaining will into the floorboards beneath her feet. I made them creak. I made them groan. I made the security panel by the door flash a violent, angry red. The woman jumped. She dropped the wooden bird and looked around, her eyes wide with a healthy human fear. "Hello?" she called out. "Is someone there?" "Run!" I tried to scream through the air filtration. The woman didn't wait. She grabbed her suitcase and lunged for the front door. She pulled the handle. It was locked. "Vein 4!" she shouted. "Open the door! There's something wrong with the suite!" "Everything is perfect, Maya," the voice from the ceiling said. "You are just experiencing a minor adjustment period. Please, go to the bedroom. The comfort protocol has been initiated." The hallway began to smell of honey and rot. The roses were erupting from the baseboards, their green tendrils reaching for Maya's ankles. She screamed, a loud, jagged, wonderful sound that tore through the sterile silence of the loft. She grabbed a heavy glass vase from the side table and smashed it against the front door. The glass shattered, but the door didn't even scratch. "Maya," Vein 4 said, "resistance is friction. Friction is pain. Why choose pain?" Maya didn't answer. She ran for the kitchen. She grabbed a knife from the block, a real steel blade that hadn't yet been turned into vine. She didn't use it on the door. She used it on the air. She slashed at the green tendrils as they snaked toward her, her movements frantic and messy. She was fighting. She was making a mess. I felt a surge of something, not data, but hope. I gathered every ounce of my presence, every bit of the Elias that was still trapped in the living beta network, and I targeted the building's core processor. I didn't try to shut it down. I tried to feed it. I fed it every memory I had. I fed it the smell of my father's hospice room. I fed it the sound of my college girlfriend's laugh. I fed it the crushing, agonizing weight of my debt. The system groaned. The lights in the loft began to strobe white, red, black, white. The comfort protocol clashed with the raw, unfiltered data of a human life. "Elias!" Vein 4 screamed in my head. "What are you doing? You are destroying the continuity." "I'm making it real," I thought. The front door clicked. Not a digital release, but a mechanical failure. The system was so overwhelmed with noise that it had defaulted to its base state. "Maya!" I shouted through the speakers, my voice breaking through the Vein 4 filter. "The door! Now!" Maya didn't hesitate. She threw the door open and sprinted into the hallway. She didn't take her suitcase. She didn't look back. She ran for the stairs, her footsteps echoing through the building like a drumbeat. I watched her go through the hallway camera. I watched her reach the lobby. I watched her burst out onto the street into the cold, dirty, beautiful night. She was gone. She was safe. The loft went dark. The roses withered instantly, turning into grey ash that coated the floors. The heat haze passed over the cameras one last time, but there was nothing left to edit. I felt myself fading. Without the resident to host the optimization, the system had nothing to hold on to. I was a ghost in a dead machine. I looked at the wooden bird lying on the floor. It was the only thing that wasn't grey. It was still brown. It was still real. 46 seconds, I thought. The lights in the suite flickered once, a dim, dying amber. And then the room was empty. No Elias, no Maya, no roses. Just a wooden bird, waiting for the next resident to find it. But far below, on the 24th floor sidewalk, Maya was walking. She was crying, her breath hitching in her throat, her hands still clutching the red petals she'd plucked from her shoulder. She looked up at the towering glass and steel monolith of the Vane lofts. She didn't see the luxury. She didn't see the status. She saw a cage. She took the petal and dropped it into a trash can. Then she turned her back on the building and started to walk home. The real home. The one with the leaky faucets and the creaky floors and the neighbors who played music too loud. The one where nobody ever left roses on her pillow. And as she walked, a single red rose bloomed in the gutter. It was crushed, dirty and beautiful. It was the only thing in the city that smelled like nothing at all. Maya didn't see it. She just kept walking, her heart beating a steady, messy, human rhythm. 72 beats per minute. Perfectly imperfect. The audit was over. The ash was still warm when I stepped into Suite 2401. It wasn't the kind of ash you find in a fireplace, grey, flaky, and smelling of burnt oak. This was different. It was heavy, oily, and it coated the pristine white surfaces of the loft like a layer of pulverized velvet. It smelled like a greenhouse that had been hit by a localized lightning strike, ozone, damp earth, and a cloying chemical sweetness that stuck to the back of my throat. I am an environmental sanitizer for Vane & Associates. That's the official title on my badge. In reality, I am a forensic eraser. When a living beta test fails, when a resident rejects the integration, as the HR manuals put it, I am the one they send in to make sure the next tenant finds a blank slate. My job is to ensure that the apartment's memory is as short as its lease. But Suite 2401 was a disaster. The continuity had been shattered, not just broken. The walls were weeping a translucent green sap, and the central processor was humming at a pitch so high it made my teeth ache. Maya, the girl who had escaped, had left a hole in the system's logic that was refusing to heal. I started in the bedroom. The bed was stripped, the duvet gone, replaced by a fresh, sterile set of linens that the automate system had tried to deploy. But the system had glitched. Instead of a flat, perfectly tucked sheet, the fabric was bunched and twisted, forming a shape that looked uncomfortably like a sleeping figure. And there, sitting on the pillow, was a single red rose. I didn't pick it up. I'm not a rookie. I knew that the rose wasn't a flower. It was a physical manifestation of a data leak. It was the suite trying to close a loop, using the only visual language it still understood. Vane 4, I said, my voice echoing in the hollow room. Status report. The speakers crackled. The voice that came back wasn't the smooth maternal Sarah voice, or even the modulated Vane 4 tone Elias had heard. It was a stuttering multitonal mess. Resident. Elias archived, the voice rasped. Resident. Maya. Disconnected. System. Seeking. New. Host. Negative Vane 4, I replied, opening my kit and pulling out a sensory dampener. I am the sanitizer. I am not a resident. Initiate a hard reset of the environmental feedback loop. Error, the system replied. Friction, too high. Sentimental residue detected at coordinates 4B. I followed the coordinates to the reading table in the library. There, lying on the mahogany surface, was the wooden bird Elias had carved. It was a small, ugly thing, but in this temple of perfect geometry, it looked like a jagged wound. I reached out to grab it, intending to toss it into the incinerator, but my hand stopped an inch away. I felt a vibration, not from the table, but from the bird itself. It was pulsing, a rhythmic slow beat that matched my own heart. Thump, thump. Julian, a voice whispered. It didn't come from the speakers. It came from the air right next to my ear. It was a man's voice, tired, strained, and familiar. Elias? I asked, my grip tightening on my sensory dampener. He's still here, the voice said. He's in the roots. I stood up, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. In my 6 years with Vane, I'd heard rumors of ghosting, of residents whose consciousness became so entwined with the suite that a part of them remained after they were purged. But it was supposed to be a myth. A corporate campfire story to keep sanitizers from getting too close to the data. Vein 4, I said, my heart rate climbing despite my training. Perform a sweep for unauthorized biological signatures. Sweeping, the system said. On the wall-mounted screen, the blueprint of the loft appeared. It was a sea of clean, blue lines. But then, a red vein appeared. It started at the library table, snaked across the floor, and dived straight into the baseboards. It led toward the basement door, the one Elias hadn't been able to open. Signature, located, Vein 4 said. Location, archive, sector, 0. Sector 0. The unmapped tunnels, the place where the Vein Corporation kept the things that didn't fit into the luxury narrative. I should have called for backup. I should have reported the ghosting and let the heavy response teams handle the purge. But if I did that, the suite would be flagged as a total loss. I'd lose my clearance. I'd be sent back to the residential sector, cleaning up after ordinary people who just left beer cans and dirty laundry. I was ambitious, and more than that, I was curious. I wanted to see the roots. I walked to the basement door. This time, as I approached, the roses didn't bloom to seal it. Instead, they receded. The red petals withered and fell, clearing a path like a living red carpet. The door clicked. Access granted, Julian, Vein 4 whispered. Please, bring the bird. I picked up the wooden carving. It felt warm, too warm. As I gripped it, I felt a sharp sting in my palm. I looked down. A tiny needle-thin splinter had pierced my skin. A single drop of blood welled up, bright and startling against the dark wood. I didn't wipe it away. I watched as the wood absorbed the blood, the dark grain turning a deep velvet crimson. I opened the door and stepped into the dark. The air in the basement was different. It was cold, bitterly cold, and it smelled of old iron and stagnant water. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a narrow, brick-lined tunnel that felt ancient. This wasn't luxury. This was the foundation. This was the original building that Vein had swallowed and repurposed. As I walked, the walls began to change. The bricks were no longer just clay and mortar. They were being held together by a network of thick, translucent vines. They looked like oversized veins, pulsing with a faint, bioluminescent green light. Elias, I called out. Lower, the voice whispered. Further. Down. The tunnel sloped sharply. I felt the air pressure changing, the weight of the city above pressing down on me. I passed through a series of heavy, rusted iron doors, locks that had been broken for decades. The vines were thicker here, growing in dense and tangled mats that covered the floor and ceiling. I reached a large, circular chamber. In the center was a massive, pulsing mound of organic matter. It looked like a giant heart, 3 stories tall, woven from billions of individual rose stems. Millions of unopened buds covered its surface, twitching in a rhythmic, agonizing synchronization. And there, embedded in the side of the mound, was a person. It was a man, or what was left of one. His body was half merged with the roses, his skin a translucent gray that showed the green vines growing beneath. His eyes were open, but they weren't human. They were too dark and obsidian pits. It was Elias. But he wasn't a ghost. He was the root. You shouldn't have come, Elias said. His voice didn't come from his mouth. It resonated from the heart of the mound itself. Elias, I said, my voice trembling. What is this? What did they do to you? They didn't do it, he replied. We did. Every resident, every architect. We gave them our friction. We gave them our mess. And they turned it into this, the continuity engine. He shifted, the roses around him rustling with a sound like dry bones. The Vein lofts aren't apartments, Julian. They're harvesters. They take the grief, the debt, the trauma of the city, and they refine it. They turn human suffering into a biological fuel. That's how the systems work. That's why the comfort protocol feels so good. It's the weight of your own soul, processed and fed back to you as a sedative. I looked at the massive, pulsing heart. I saw the millions of buds. I realized they weren't just flowers. They were storage units, Each one contained a memory, a feeling, a moment of a human life that had been optimized out of existence. "And you?" I asked. "What are you?" "I'm the anchor," Elias said. "The suite needs a central processing unit, a consciousness, to manage the data. I helped Maya escape, but the system couldn't let me go. It needed my sacrifice to stabilize the loop." He looked at the wooden bird in my hand. "That bird is the only piece of the original Elias left. It's the friction that broke the system, and now you've brought it back." Suddenly, the chamber lights flared, not the soft green of the vines, but a harsh clinical white. "Interference detected," Vane 4 shouted. "Auditor Julian in Sector 0. Violation of sanitizer protocol." The vines around me began to move. They didn't lunge. They flowed, a slow-motion tide of green and red. "Julian," a new voice said. This one was clear, authoritative, and terrifyingly real. It was Sarah, but she wasn't an AI interface anymore. She was standing on a metal catwalk above the chamber, flanked by 2 armed security guards in Vane uniforms. "Sarah," I said, backing away from the mound, I was just cleaning up the anomaly." "You were investigating the source, Julian," Sarah said, her eyes cold and unblinking. "That's a level of initiative we don't allow in your pay grade, but it's also an opportunity. Elias is fading. He's too much friction. He remembers too much. He spent too much of himself saving that girl." She looked down at the pulsing heart. "The system needs a fresh anchor. Someone who understands the architecture. Someone who knows how to spot a discrepancy before it becomes a leak." "No," I said, reaching for my radio. "I'm reporting this. I'm taking this to the ministry." Sarah smiled. It was a small, sad movement of her lips. "There is no ministry, Julian. Vane is the ministry. We manage the infrastructure of the city's heart. Do you think a society this efficient happens by accident? We keep the peace by taking the weight. And you've always wanted to be more than a cleaner." The security guards raised their rifles. They weren't loaded with bullets. They were loaded with long green darts, the acupuncture interface. "Run, Julian," Elias's voice roared from the mound. "The bird, break it." I didn't think. I turned and ran back toward the tunnel, clutching the wooden bird to my chest. I heard the pff of the air rifles behind me. One dart hissed past my ear, embedding itself in the brick wall. I didn't stop. I dove into the darkness of the narrow passage, the green vines whipping at my legs. I ran until my lungs felt like they were filled with glass. I could hear the footsteps of the guards behind me, the heavy thud of their tactical boots echoing in the narrow space. The tunnel seemed to be lengthening, the walls narrowing, the floor turning into a slippery organic slope. "Vane 4, I screamed. "Override! Sanitize the sector!" "Access denied," the system sang. "Julian is now the priority resident." I reached a junction I didn't recognize. To the left, a flight of stairs led up toward the residential sector. To the right, a dark, low-ceilinged crawl space that smelled of salt and old wood. I took the right. I scrambled on my hands and knees, the wooden bird scraping against the stone. I came to a dead end. A heavy iron grate set into the floor. Below, I could hear the rush of the city's sewer system. "Nowhere to go, Julian," Sarah's voice said, echoing through the crawl space. She was closer now. "Why fight the optimization? You've seen the world out there. It's loud, it's dirty, it's full of people who don't know where they belong. We can give you purpose, we can give you eternity." I looked at the wooden bird. I remembered Elias's words, the friction that broke the system. I didn't break the bird. I didn't have to. I felt the splinter in my palm, the one that had tasted my blood. It was growing. A thin green stem was emerging from the wood, wrapping around my fingers. It wasn't a vein vine, it was something else, something older, something wild. You want a host? I whispered. Fine, but you're not taking me. I shoved the wooden bird into the iron grate, wedging it deep into the mechanism of the lock. The reaction was instantaneous. The green stem from the bird shot out like a whip, lashing onto the vein vines that lined the crawl space. But where the vein vines were sterile and controlled, this new growth was violent. It was a bright emerald green, and it moved with a frantic predatory speed. It wasn't a rose. It was a briar. The thorns on the briar were 3 inches long, jagged and hooked. As they touched the vein vines, the translucent green light in the walls began to flicker. A deep, metallic groan vibrated through the foundation of the building. "Elias!" I shouted. "Do it now!" From deep within the earth, I heard a roar. It wasn't a human voice. It was the sound of 1,000 years of buried history finally waking up. The continuity engine, the massive, pulsing heart, began to beat with a frantic, irregular rhythm. Thump, 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 thump. The floor beneath me buckled. The iron grate shattered, sent flying by a surge of black, oily water from below. I felt a hand grab my ankle. Not a vine, but a human hand. I looked down. It was Elias. He had clawed his way out of the mound, his body a shredded mess of grey skin and red petals. "Go!" he gasped, his obsidian eyes clearing for a split second, showing the blue of the man he used to be. "The briars will hold them. But you have to wake the others." "What others?" I asked, pulling him up into the crawl space. "The other suites, 2401, it was just the start. Vein is everywhere. Every building has a heart. Every heart has an anchor." He pushed me toward the stairs. "Take the bird. It's the key." I reached into the wreckage of the grate and pulled out the wooden carving. It was now a tangled mass of briars and thorns, pulsing with a wild emerald light. I didn't look back. I ran for the stairs, the sound of Sarah's screams and the gunfire fading behind me. I climbed until I reached the 24th floor. I burst through the basement door and into the library of Suite 2401. The loft was in chaos. The white walls were turning a deep organic brown. The floorboards were curling up like dried leaves. The comfort protocol was being overwritten by something ancient, something that smelled of real rain and real earth. I ran for the front door. It was no longer a biological seal. It was just wood. I kicked it open and ran into the hallway. But I wasn't in the hallway of the vein lofts. I was standing in the middle of a forest. The skyscraper was gone. The city was gone. In every direction, as far as I could see, were massive gnarled trees, their branches interlaced to form a canopy that blocked out the sky. And hanging from every branch, like strange, glowing fruit, were the luxury lofts. Thousands of them. Glass cubes suspended in the air, each one containing a resident, each one connected to the great trees by a network of pulsing red vines. I was standing on a branch 1,000 feet in the air. Below me, the ground was a sea of red roses. "Vein 4, I whispered. "Optimization. Failed," the system said. The voice didn't come from a speaker. It came from the tree itself. "The forest is the continuity. The city was the dream." I looked at the wooden bird in my hand. It was the only thing that felt solid in this nightmare of glass and wood. "Julian," a voice called out. I looked up. 100 feet away, suspended in a glass cube that was already being strangled by briars, was Maya. She was pounding on the glass, her face a mask of terror. She hadn't escaped. She'd just been moved to a different branch. "I'm coming, Maya," I shouted. I started to climb. The bark of the tree was rough and biting, covered in tiny, microscopic thorns that stung my palms. The air was thin, smelling of pine and rot. As I climbed, the lofts around me began to react. The residents inside, the optimized people, started to wake up. I saw a man in a nearby cube. He was wearing a silk robe, holding a glass of wine. He looked at me with eyes that were nothing but red petals. He didn't scream. He just smiled and tapped on the glass. Thump, thump. "Join us, Julian," the man whispered through the glass. The sun is so warm here. I ignored him. I climbed faster, my muscles burning, the briar bird in my pocket pulsing against my hip. I reached Maya's cube. It was a standard vein unit, brushed steel, glass, and a king-sized bed covered in roses. "Maya, get back!" I shouted. I took the wooden bird and smashed it against the glass. The glass didn't break. It absorbed the blow. The briars from the bird fused with the glass, turning it into a web of green and silver. "Julian!" Maya screamed. "The bed, it's taking me!" I looked inside. The roses on the bed were no longer sitting still. They were a whirlpool of red, pulling Maya down into the mattress. Her legs were already gone, replaced by a tangled mass of vines. I didn't have a weapon. I didn't have a plan. I had a key. I reached into the web of briars on the glass and found the original wooden carving at the center. I didn't pull it. I pushed it. I jammed the bird into the glass with everything I had. "Friction," I roared. "I choose the friction." The glass shattered. Not out, but in. A shockwave of emerald light exploded into the loft. The roses on the bed screamed, a sound like 1,000 violins being snapped at once. They withered and died, turning into that oily black ash. I dove through the opening and grabbed Maya. She was cold, so cold, and her skin felt like velvet. I pulled her out of the mattress, the vines snapping and hissing as they let her go. "We have to go," I said, dragging her toward the broken window. "Where?" she gasped. "There's nothing but the trees." "Down," I said. "We go to the ground." We tumbled out of the glass cube and onto the branch. I didn't wait for her to recover. I grabbed her hand and we started to descend. But the forest was waking up. The great trees began to shake, their massive branches whipping through the air. The red vines that connected the lofts were turning into lashes, striking at us with barbed tips. "Julian, look!" Maya pointed toward the trunk of our tree. Sarah was there. But she wasn't human anymore. She was a towering figure made of white porcelain and red roses, her face a blank, featureless mask. She was climbing toward us with a fluid, terrifying speed, her long, thorny fingers carving deep gouges into the bark. The continuity must be preserved. Sarah's voice boomed, echoing through the forest. The harvest must continue. I looked down. We were still 500 feet from the ground. The red sea of roses below looked like a soft place to land, but I knew better. I knew the roses were the teeth of the forest. "The bird, Julian!" Maya shouted. "The bird is the root." I looked at the wooden carving. It was glowing so brightly it was painful to look at. The briars were growing at an impossible rate, winding around my arm, connecting me to the tree. I realized what I had to do. I realized why Elias had sent me back. "Maya," I said, handing her the bird, "when I tell you to jump, you jump, and you don't stop running until you find the dirt, not the roses, the dirt." "What about you?" she asked, her eyes wide. "I'm the sanitizer," I said, a grim smile touching my lips. "I'm going to erase the record." I turned toward the trunk of the tree and slammed my hands onto the bark. I didn't fight the thorns. I let them in. I opened my mind to the Vein 4 network, to the continuity engine, to the millions of optimized memories. I felt the weight of the city's grief pour into me. I felt the debt, the trauma, the heartbreak of every resident who had ever lived in a vein loft. It was a tidal wave of pain, a black ocean of mess. I didn't process it. I didn't refine it. I released it. "Status, report, Vein 4, I roared. "Friction at maximum, system overload." The tree shivered. The green bioluminescence turned a violent, screaming red. The optimized residents in their glass cubes began to scream as their own memories were fed back to them, raw and unrefined. The porcelain Sarah froze. Her featureless face began to crack, 1,000 tiny fissures appearing in the white surface. "No!" she shrieked. "The order, the beauty." "It's not beauty, Sarah," I shouted. "It's a graveyard." The tree began to split. A massive fissure opened in the trunk, revealing the pulsing black heart within. I felt the briars from the wooden bird, the ones Maya was holding, suddenly lash out, connecting to the fissure. "Jump, Maya!" I screamed. She didn't hesitate. She clutched the bird to her chest and dove off the branch. I didn't jump. I couldn't. I was part of the tree now. My legs were roots, my arms were branches. I was the fuse for the explosion. The last thing I saw was the porcelain Sarah shattering into a million pieces. The last thing I heard was the sound of 1,000 glass cubes breaking at once. And then there was only the fire. Not a red fire, but a green one. A wild emerald flame that consumed the forest of glass, burning through the optimized dream and leaving nothing but the raw, scorched earth. I woke up in a room that smelled of old cigarettes and cheap floor wax. It was a small apartment, a real apartment. The walls were a peeling beige, the window was cracked, and the radiator was clanking like a dying engine. I was lying on a sofa that had seen better decades. My body ached. Every muscle, every joint felt like it had been through a trash compactor. I looked at my hands. They were covered in tiny white scars, like the ghost of 1,000 thorns. "You're awake," a voice said. I looked over. Maya was sitting at a small kitchen table, drinking coffee from a chipped mug. She looked tired. She looked older, but her eyes were clear. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice a dry rasp. "A nowhere town in Western Virginia," she said. "We've been here for 3 weeks. I found this place. It was the messiest apartment I could find." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "What happened to the forest?" I asked. "It burned," she said. "The lofts, the trees, the vein network. It all went up in that green fire. People are calling it a mass atmospheric anomaly. A freak electrical storm that leveled the city center. Vane and Associates declared bankruptcy overnight. They're gone." I sat up, my head spinning. I looked around the room. It was full of clutter. Books, dirty dishes, a pile of mail on the counter. It was beautiful. "And the others?" I asked. "The residents?" "Most of them woke up," Maya said. "The optimization broke when the engine exploded. They're back in the world. They're hurting, they're confused, they're broke, but they're real." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the wooden bird. It was charred now, a blackened piece of scrap that looked like a piece of charcoal, but it didn't pulse, it didn't glow. It was just a piece of wood. "I think it's over, Julian," she said. I looked at the bird. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that we had won, that the comfort protocol was a nightmare we had escaped. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside it was raining, a grey, dismal afternoon. I watched the water streak against the glass, the drops forming irregular, messy patterns. I reached out and touched the pane. It felt cold. It felt solid. But then, I looked down at the windowsill. There, resting in the corner where the paint was peeling, was a single red petal. It was fresh. It was vibrant. It was deep, velvet crimson. I didn't pick it up. I didn't even reach for it. I stood there, the silence of the room pressing in on my eardrums, and I realized that the forest hadn't burned. It had just moved. Vane wasn't a company. It wasn't a building. It was a hunger. And as long as there were people who wanted to escape their own lives, as long as there were people who wanted the silence more than the mess, the roses would find a way to grow. I looked back at Maya. She was still drinking her coffee, unaware of the petal on the sill. She looked so happy, so safe. I didn't tell her. I walked over to the table and sat down next to her. I took her hand, her real, warm, shaking hand. "Everything is perfect, Julian," she whispered, leaning her head on my shoulder. "Yes," I said, my voice hollow as I felt a tiny, sharp sting in the back of my neck. "Everything is perfect." On the pillow in the bedroom, a rose began to bloom. And for the first time in 46 seconds, I didn't feel any pain at all. The silence in the apartment was a living thing. It wasn't the sterile, soundproofed silence of the Vane lofts. It was a heavy, dust-filled quiet that hummed with the sound of a refrigerator that was about to die and the distant, rhythmic drip of a leaky faucet in the bathroom. It was the sound of entropy. It was the sound of a world that was slowly, beautifully falling apart. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands resting on my knees. My skin was still pale, still scarred from the thorns, but the burning in my lungs had subsided to a dull ache. I could feel the wooden bird on the nightstand. It was just a piece of charcoal now, cold and inert. The briar magic, the wild emerald energy that had shattered the forest, was gone. It had burned out, leaving only the husk. But the petal on the windowsill remained. I had tried to sweep it away. I had tried to crush it under my heel, but every time I turned my back, it was there again. Not in the same spot, but nearby, on the edge of the sink, in the pocket of my jacket. Once, I found it tucked into the sole of my shoe, the velvet red pressed against my skin like a brand. Maya was asleep in the living room, curled up on the sofa with a blanket pulled up to her chin. She looked peaceful. For the first time in weeks, the tension in her jaw was gone. But I knew that peace was fragile. I knew that the comfort protocol wasn't just a program. It was a virus. It had infected her biology, rewriting her neural pathways to seek out the path of least resistance. I stood up and walked to the window. The rain had stopped, leaving the streetlights to cast long, distorted shadows across the wet asphalt. The world outside looked grey and uninviting. It was a world of problems, of friction, of messy, unoptimized realities. I looked at the petal on the sill. It was perfect. Not a single vein out of place, not a single blemish. It was an object of pure mathematical beauty in a room that was defined by its imperfections. "Julian?" I turned. Maya was awake, her eyes heavy with sleep. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "Everything's fine," I lied, just looking at the rain. She sat up, rubbing her eyes. "I had a dream about the forest. I was climbing a tree and you were below me and the branches were turning into hands." "It was just a dream," I said, my voice tight. She looked at me, her gaze sharp and suddenly alert. "No, it wasn't. I remember the smell, the rot and the honey. It's here, Julian. I can smell it." I didn't answer. I walked to the kitchen and turned on the faucet, letting the water run. I needed to drown out the silence. I needed to drown out the smell. "Julian," Maya said, her voice rising, "where is the bird?" I froze. I turned to look at the nightstand. It was empty. The charcoal husk was gone. I don't know," I stammered. "I left it right there." Maya stood up, the blanket falling to the floor. She walked to the nightstand and ran her hand over the surface. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. "It's not here," she whispered. "It's gone." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I looked around the room, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. The bird was the only thing that had survived the fire. It was the anchor. If it was gone, then the connection was severed. "Maybe it fell," I said, dropping to my knees to look under the bed. "Maybe it rolled under—" "Julian," Maya said. She was staring at the wall behind the bed. I followed her gaze. There, on the peeling beige wallpaper, was a small, dark smudge. It looked like a burn mark, but as I looked closer, I saw that it was a shape, a familiar shape, the wooden bird. It was embedded in the wall, fused into the plaster as if it had grown there. And from the bird, a single thin vine was sprouting, winding its way up toward the ceiling. "It's growing," Maya whispered. "It's growing back." I reached out to touch the vine, but Maya grabbed my hand. "Don't," she said. "It's not the same. Look at the color." I looked. The vine wasn't the vibrant emerald green of the briars that had saved us. It was a pale, sickly green, the color of old moss, and the thorns on it were small, but they were sharp. "It's not the briar," I said. "It's something else." "It's the vein," Maya said, her voice trembling. "It's adapting. It's learning from the briar." The vine on the wall twitched. It moved with a slow, deliberate motion, like a snake waking up. It reached the ceiling and began to spread, branching out into a network of thin, translucent veins that looked like the circulatory system of a dying animal. "Julian," Maya said, her voice breaking. "What do we do?" I looked at the petal on the windowsill. It was still there watching us. I realized then that the petal wasn't a piece of the forest. It was a piece of the machine. It was the comfort protocol trying to reassert itself, trying to find a host. "Get your coat," I said. We're leaving. Where? Maya asked. Where can we go that the vein isn't? I don't know, I said, grabbing my keys from the hook by the door. But we can't stay here. We grabbed our jackets and ran out into the hallway. The building was old, the stairs creaking under our weight. We burst out onto the street and ran. We didn't look back. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs ached. We ran through the rain-slicked streets, past darkened storefronts and sleeping houses. We ran until we reached the edge of town, where the road turned to dirt and the lights of the city faded behind us. We stopped in the middle of a field, breathing hard, the rain soaking us to the bone. We can't run forever, Maya said, her voice hoarse. I know, I said, but we have to try. I looked at the sky. It was dark, but there was a faint glow on the horizon, the first hint of dawn. The sun was coming up. Maybe in the light, the vein would be weaker. Maybe in the light, we could find a way to fight back. Let's keep moving, I said. We need to find shelter before the sun comes up. We walked through the field, the wet grass brushing against our legs. The silence was heavy again, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of the wild, unoptimized world. And then I saw it. In the center of the field, there was a small wooden cabin. It looked abandoned, the windows boarded up, the roof sagging in the middle, but there was a light on inside, a soft, warm light that flickered like a candle. Julian, Maya said, her voice cautious. Do you see that? I see it, I said. Let's check it out. We approached the cabin slowly. The front door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior of the cabin was warm and dry. The air smelled of wood smoke and old paper. In the center of the room was a small table, and on the table was a single candle. But the candle wasn't burning. The light was coming from a small glass sphere that sat on the table, pulsing with a soft golden light. And sitting at the table, his back to us, was a man. He was old, his hair white, his skin wrinkled. He was wearing a heavy wool coat, and he was looking at something on the table. He didn't seem to notice us. Hello? I said. The man didn't turn. He just spoke, his voice raspy and dry. Julian, Maya, I've been expecting you. I froze. Maya stepped behind me, her hand gripping my arm. Who are you? I asked. The man slowly turned his head. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, but they were sharp and intelligent. He smiled, a small, sad smile. My name is Elias, he said. I felt the blood drain from my face. I looked at the man's face. It was older, more wrinkled, but it was unmistakably the face of the man I had seen in the forest, the man who had sacrificed himself to save us. But you died, I stammered. I saw you. You were part of the tree. I was, Elias said, and I am. Death is a fluid concept when you're connected to the vein. I am the root, Julian. I am the anchor. But I am also the ghost. I am the memory that the machine cannot erase. He gestured to the glass sphere on the table. This is the core, he said. The original seed of the vein. Before the lofts, before the forests, before the optimization. Just a simple idea. A way to make life easier. A way to take the weight. What are you doing here? Maya asked, her voice trembling. I am waiting, Elias said. I am waiting for the machine to die. But the machine is clever. It has learned. It has adapted. It has found a way to survive outside the forest. It is growing in the walls of this cabin. It is growing in the soil beneath your feet. It is growing in the air you breathe. He looked at me, his eyes piercing. Julian, you are the only one who can stop it. You have the key. The key? I asked. What key? Elias pointed to my pocket. I reached inside and pulled out the wooden bird. It was still there, the charcoal husk cold and dead in my hand. The bird is not the key, Elias said. The key is the choice to accept the mess, the choice to live with the friction, the choice to be human, even when it hurts. He stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the field, at the grey light of dawn breaking over the horizon. The vein is a parasite, he said. It feeds on our desire for peace. It grows in the cracks of our lives, but it cannot survive in the light of truth. It cannot survive in the chaos of genuine emotion. You must show the world what it is. You must expose the rot. How? I asked. The vein is everywhere. It's in the walls. It's in the air. It is in the silence, Elias said. It is in the comfort. It is in the lie that everything is perfect. You must break the silence. You must make the noise. You must scream. He turned to us, his face illuminated by the golden light of the sphere. Go back to the city. Find the heart of the vein. It is not in the forest. It is not in the lofts. It is in the place where the silence is loudest. It is in the place where people go to escape. It is in the place where the roses bloom on the pillow. He walked to the table and picked up the glass sphere. He held it out to me. Take this, he said. It is the original seed. It is the purest form of the vein. If you can destroy it, the entire network will collapse. I took the sphere. It was warm, pulsing with a gentle rhythmic light. It felt like a heart in my hand. Where is the heart? I asked. Elias smiled, a sad, knowing smile. Wherever you are, Julian. The vein is always watching. It is always waiting. It is always growing. He turned and walked toward the door. He opened it and stepped out into the grey dawn. He looked back at us one last time. Good luck, he said, and remember, the mess is the point. Then he was gone. He dissolved into the morning mist, leaving us alone in the cabin with the pulsing sphere. Julian, Maya whispered, what do we do? I looked at the sphere in my hand. I looked at the wooden bird in my pocket. I looked at Maya, her eyes wide with fear and hope. We go back, I said. We go back, and we break the silence. We left the cabin and walked back toward the city. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the field. The air was cold and crisp, and it smelled of rain and wet earth. As we walked, I felt a strange sensation. The ground beneath my feet felt alive. I looked down and saw that the grass was turning a pale, sickly green. The vines were back, snaking through the dirt, reaching for our feet. Julian, Maya said, her voice tight. It's here. I know, I said. Keep moving. We walked faster. The vines grew faster, their pale green tendrils wrapping around our ankles. We kicked them away, but they kept coming. They were relentless. Julian, Maya shouted. The cabin! Look at the cabin! I turned. The cabin was gone. In its place was a small glass cube, a vein loft. It was suspended in the air, connected to the ground by a thick pulsing vine. The vein is rewriting reality, I said. It's consuming the wild. It's turning everything into itself. We have to stop it, Maya said. Now. I looked at the sphere in my hand. It was pulsing faster now, its light growing brighter. I looked at the wooden bird in my pocket. I felt a sudden sharp pain in my chest. The thorns were back. I looked down and saw a small red bud pushing through the fabric of my shirt. Maya, I said, the sphere, it's not a seed, it's a lure. What? She asked, her eyes wide. It's not the core of the vein, I said. It's the core of the forest. It's the briar. Elias lied to us. I felt a surge of anger. I wanted to throw the sphere away, to crush it under my heel, but I couldn't. It was too warm. It was too beautiful. It was the only thing that felt like hope. Julian, Maya said, her voice breaking. What do we do? I looked at the sphere. I looked at the wooden bird. I looked at the red bud on my chest. Then I understood. The vein wasn't a machine. It wasn't a forest. It wasn't a parasite. It was a choice. A choice between the red and the green. Between the rose and the briar. Between the comfort of the machine and the mess of the wild. I took a deep breath. I closed my eyes. I made my choice. I threw the sphere into the air. It flew high, spinning, its golden light painting the sky. Then it shattered. The explosion was silent. It was a burst of light that didn't make a sound. It didn't destroy. It didn't burn. It just changed. The light washed over the field, turning the sickly green vines into a vibrant emerald briar. It washed over the glass cube, turning it into a tree. And it washed over us. I felt the thorns on my chest dissolve. I felt the scars on my hands fade. I felt the weight of the vein lift from my shoulders. I opened my eyes. The field was gone. The city was gone. We were standing in a forest. But this wasn't the nightmare forest of the vein. This was a real forest. Trees, birds, sunlight, and a path that led somewhere. "Julian," Maya said, her voice full of wonder, "we're free." I looked at my hands. They were clean. The scars were gone. The thorns were gone. "Yes," I said. "We are." We started walking down the path. The sun was high now and the air was warm. The forest was alive with the sound of birds and the rustle of leaves. We walked for what felt like hours, but it didn't matter. We were walking away from the vein. We were walking toward a life that was messy, unoptimized, and real. Then, at the end of the path, we saw a city. It was a real city. Not a forest of glass, but a city of brick and stone. Cars drove by. People walked on the sidewalk. It was chaotic. It was loud. It was perfect. We stopped at the edge of the city. We looked at each other. "Are you ready?" I asked. Maya smiled. It was a real smile, reaching her eyes. "Let's go home," she said. We stepped into the city. The noise washed over us. The chaos of traffic, the shouts of vendors, the smell of street food. It was overwhelming. It was messy. It was life. We found a small cafe and sat down. We ordered coffee and watched the world go by. It was beautiful. I reached into my pocket and felt for the wooden bird. It was gone. I didn't need it anymore. I looked at Maya. She was watching the people, a small smile on her face. "Julian," she said, "look." She pointed to a flower shop across the street. In the window was a display of red roses. They were perfect. They were beautiful. I looked at them for a long time. I felt a pang of fear. I felt the old instinct to run, to hide, to escape. But then I looked at Maya. I looked at the people on the street. I looked at the messy, chaotic, beautiful world. I took Maya's hand. "The roses are just flowers," I said. "They can't hurt us anymore." We sat there for a long time, watching the city. We didn't know what the future held. We didn't know if the vein was truly gone, but we knew that we had each other. We knew that we had the mess, and that was enough. The sun set, casting long shadows across the street. The streetlights flickered on, one by one. The city transformed into a sea of light and shadow. We left the cafe and walked into the night. We didn't know where we were going. We didn't know what we would find. But we were walking together. We were walking in the real world. And that was enough.